Good morning.
Good morning.
We are at the Freiburg New Church Assembly. Today is Monday, August 12th. Our theme for this week is genuine human and spiritual community in light of New Church teachings. I'm Gard and my title is Toward Genuine Community, Part 1. So, my interpretation of the theme is that we can look at the state of community at whatever scale any one of the speakers wishes in light of what we find of genuine community in heaven and in other parts of New Church teaching. Now, I've taken this as permission to assess with you a version of the state of democracy in our country today. I will do so in a way that is non-partisan, and I will do so with an aim to achieve, find, explore spiritual depth. My plan is to three-part plan. I will start with a vision of unified human community. Then I will present evidence that in our society today there appears to be the opposite, divisions that threaten our constitutional norms and democracy. And I will make the case, third, that the only true antidote is a, quote, transformation of consciousness. And I'm in good company when I say that. You'll hear that come up in the first vision from Edgar Mitchell of a unified human community. And this transformation of consciousness is of the sort that we can find in Swedenborg's writings. Now here I'd like to pause and ask were there any of those of you who slept at the academy? Oh, wait a minute now. I'm having a little trouble stringing words together for certain reasons, and it's related to my question. Are there any of those who slept at the Freiburg New Church Assembly who were aware of construction noises? Raise your hand. Okay. I was amazed at how loud those were. So at dawn, when I got up anyway, I went outside to see what machines are making that much noise, because I was sure there was a rock-crushing machine. However, I can testify that large dump trucks with big heavy gates and lots of material, a very large bulldozer, and we used to call it a steamroller, but it's a roller which shakes the building. I can assure you that those three machines make that much noise. Now, I mention this because it presents a problem.
Understatement.
I've tried to string together some ideas that are carefully linked and difficult to follow. Not only that, within one set of ideas, I go pretty deep into wonky policy analysis. It's going to be tough. And I figure I'm going to see some eyes glaze over. That will precede full-on heads back and falling sideways in the chair. So, to address this problem, I'm going to start, I'll summarize my three ideas right now, and I'm going to get to the most difficult one right away. And then we'll come back to it. Okay. So with that, I thank you for being with me. We'll start with a vision of unified humanity that comes from Edgar Mitchell's well-known quote. I will present evidence that there's the opposite, divisions that threaten the cohesion of our society, the very foundations of our democracy, and we'll make the case that a transformation of consciousness is called for. Now, I'm going to start with the most difficult idea. What is that transformation of consciousness? Well, it comes from an intriguing sentence in Heaven and Hell, number 51. It begins like this. It is worth noting what we have in common with angels and what we possess that they don't. Wow, what is that? What we have in common with angels is the fact that the deeper levels of our minds are formed in the image of heaven. Deeper levels of our minds are formed in the image of heaven, and that they can be opened with a practice of mutual love. They can be opened with a practice of mutual love. That's what we have in common with angels. Levels of our mind in the image of heaven that can be opened deeper and deeper with the practice of mutual love. What we have that angels lack and don't have is that our minds, the more outward levels of our mind, are formed in the image of the world. Angels do not have that. They did, but they don't now. We still do. The more outward levels of our minds are formed in the image of the world. And that is what I'm going to be talking about, an image of the world, writ large, the scale of our democracy. Now here's the shift. And that to the extent that we are in a state of mutual love, the world is subordinated to heaven and serves it. The Lord is then present with us on both levels of our minds. And one more time. The more outward levels of our mind are formed in the image of the world. We are still here. Angels don't have that. And to the extent that we are in a state of mutual love in the world, our image of the world is subordinated to the levels of heaven and serve heaven. The Lord is then present with us on both levels of our minds. And I propose that as a transformation of consciousness that is required. Okay. Part one is a unified vision of the world. Many of you know that Edgar Mitchell, an astronaut, is quoted here and many other places as his experience of seeing the Earth from his capsule in space. He writes, "It began with a breathtaking experience of seeing the planet Earth floating in the immensity of space, the incredible beauty of a splendid blue and white jewel floating in the vast black sky. I underwent a religious-like experience in which the presence of divinity became almost palpable. And I knew that life in the universe was not just an accident based on random processes. This knowledge came directly, intuitively, was not a matter of discursive reading, reasoning, or logical abstraction. It was not deduced from information perceptible by sense organs. The realization was subjective, but it was knowledge every bit as compelling and real as the objective data in the navigational system and communications that it was based upon." Then my thoughts turned to the daily life on the planet, and with that my sense of wonderment gradually turned into something like anguish. I realized that at the very moment people were fighting wars, committing murder and other crimes, lying, cheating, struggling for power, for status, abusing the environment by polluting the water and the air, wasting natural resources, ravaging the land, acting out of lust and greed, hurting others through ignorance, intolerance, bigotry, prejudice, and all the other feelings that add up to man's inhumanity to man. As I survey the challenge facing humanity today, he wrote at that time, I see only one answer, a transformation of consciousness. And finally, a value-free, objective, rational, experimental mode of Western science based on materialism is not sufficient for coping with the ever-increasing planetary crises besetting civilization. Okay, so that's the view of unity. He mentions transformation of consciousness as the only solution, and he's not the only one. There are many others who use that same phrase, and we've touched on what a transformation of consciousness might look like from New Church teachings is some kind of reversal of the levels of our mind within our experience in the world. So now I'll shift to the evidence that there is something less than unity in our experience today, in the experience of the world. By world, I'm limiting myself to our nation. It's a little more than that, a little less than that. It's bigger, it's in the world, and it's smaller in our communities of choice. There is evidence to suggest that there are forces operating in society that put cohesion of our society and the very foundations of democracy at risk. Society appears to be dangerously polarized. There is a loss of civil discourse and government gridlock. Now, I want to reiterate that as I proceed with this analysis, there is no attempt to present or promote a point of view. In fact, the assessment which I will offer is not mine. Much of it was new to me, and I will give credit to that point of view when we get there. And I happen to agree with much of it, but you may not. So the task that I invite us all into is to listen with temporary suspension of disbelief or outrage, and simply listen to what this author, professor, I'll mention in a minute, has to say. And if there's truth in what he says, what would be your response? And what light can we see shed from the teachings of our church, including the view from heaven? So that's our task. Thank you for participating. And I begin with this critique. It's very severe, from an author who observed the state of public life, and I quote, very brief: "There is insatiable greed, self-centeredness, domination of the less fortunate, desire for absolute control." The author continues, quote, "But societies and cultures are not greedy, people are. Insatiable greed, self-centeredness, domination of the less fortunate, desire for absolute control. Societies and cultures are not greedy, people are." Harvey Cox of the Harvard Divinity School wrote these words in a book assessing the state of public life. The year was 1973. Some of what we're experiencing today might not be entirely new. So what is at stake when one says that we are at risk of losing our society, of losing our democracy? Well, recall the constituent elements of a democratic society. Free and fair elections, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, an independent judiciary, checks and balances between the legislative, executive, and judicial branches of government to prevent the excessive concentration of power. Civil rights, the guarantee of minority rights, the provision of public goods such as education, health, and well-being, and the rule of law. Free and fair elections, freedom of speech, freedom of the press. Remember, there's no agenda in listing these. These are simply the foundations of a democracy, and we do have a democracy. Free and fair elections, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, independent judiciary, checks and balances between the branches of government, guarantee of minority rights, provision of public goods, education, health, and well-being, civil liberties, and the rule of law. All of these are present. Now, this list was introduced in that speech to which I referred. It was delivered at the Mid-Coast Forum of Foreign Relations in Northport, Maine, at an annual meeting in June of this year. It was by one Professor John Shattuck of the Fletcher School of Public Policy at Tufts University. Now, I'd like to follow his analysis fairly closely, giving myself permission to hear some really interesting ideas and historical analysis of how he believes, and he's informed. He's been a diplomat in the U.S. and Europe, a long-time observer. Gave a very interesting talk, which I'm going to the highlights of which I will present now. And at the end of it, he presents 5 conditions that, in his view, need to pertain to save democracy, which he believes is at risk. 5 conditions need to pertain. I'll read those 5 conditions at the end, 3 of which I find directly related to the practice of mutual love of the sort that is the transformation of consciousness which is called for. I'll be interested to hear your thoughts on that. So, this professor of public policy began with asking his audience to recall 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall. What many thought was to be a golden age of democratic reform throughout Europe and Eastern Europe and perhaps beyond. It was a golden age with the collapse of the Berlin Wall, the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia with Václav Havel, a peaceful change from one-party communist rule to parliamentary democracy. Student, worker, absolute joy. It was a wonderful time. Globalism was heralded as a new form of allowing capital to transfer across borders to lift all people in a new economic well-being, heralded as good for all. And democracies throughout the former Soviet Union and beyond were being birthed. So that was the golden age. Some of you may remember this, and some of you are hearing it now. In 1989, there was genuine optimism. However, the professor continues, the fall of the Berlin Wall did not only unleash forces for integration and unity. There were forces of disintegration that swept the globe as well. There was a downside to globalization that became apparent with loss of jobs and many people feeling left out and left behind. The breakup of the former of the former Yugoslavia resulted in ethnic wars for which the international community was largely unprepared. There was 9/11. There were wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and a largely failed, in the eyes of some, Arab Spring. Massive dislocation of populations from these wars and from failed states in Africa. That's a sober assessment of the state of play after 1989, where there were 2 forces, one of integration, which seemed so hopeful, and one of disintegration, which now appears to have been alarmingly inevitable. And this would challenge hitherto stable democracies. And then things got worse. For there was a collision, as he reported, of these two forces with 3 revolutions. There was a populist rebellion, and that collision came in the form of a populist rebellion that spread slowly at first, but in the eyes of some is now quite evident. A populist rebellion in reaction to 3 major revolutions. The market reform of the 1980s that cut government spending drastically, primarily affecting those who depended on the social safety net. It's when big government wasn't the problem, government was the problem. Another revolution of the 3, the second is a little earlier, civil rights. Civil rights of the 60s broadened our democracy, but came with a counter-revolution led by those who felt threatened by the newfound power of minorities and women. The third is the digital revolution, which kind of added fuel to the problem. It resulted in increased communication, and no one would want to not have the digital revolution. It resulted in increased communication and workplace productivity, but came with echo chambers of self-selected information, a loss of narrative based on facts and truth, and the spread of disinformation. So the ground of our democracy had shifted from relatively stable forms of government and institutions in which there was a measure of trust to the loss of a shared narrative of what America is and replaced by anger and fear. Serious stuff if this is true. Okay, I'm going to get to the 5 things, so just going to look back just for a moment before I get to the 5 conditions necessary. There was great optimism at the fall of the Berlin Wall and the breakup of the Soviet Union. Mikhail Gorbachev and glasnost was a new kind of economic reform in the Soviet Union, a great Velvet Revolution, globalism, all seemingly good stuff and good stuff. But there was a counter force. There were those who felt left behind and were, in the view of this author. There was 9/11, wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, massive population displacement. We see this today. These are forces of chaos and disintegration, and they collided. And they collided in this country in the face of market reform in the 1980s, where government shrank drastically, in the face of the civil rights movement with the giving the vote to those who hadn't had it before, election reform, very good stuff, broadened the base of our democracy, increased dialogue between ethnic and racial groups, but came with a counter-revolution of those threatened by newfound power of minorities and women. And then this very interesting digital revolution. How problematic it is. It's wonderful, and yet now we're facing the consequences that hadn't been foreseen is disinformation and a kind of loss of education among people where there can be dialogue across differences. So what are the 5 things that would have to happen to save our democracy in the eyes of Professor Shattuck, as delivered to the Mid-Coast Forum on Foreign Relations in Northport in June? The first is to understand the populist rebellion as an authentic response to inequality and the excesses of globalism. We need to listen to their demands. They need to be taken seriously, and they need to be included in the benefits of economic prosperity. We need to listen to those in the populist rebellion, as he calls There needs to be a building of coalitions across political divides to put aside differences in order to connect for an inclusive, not exclusive, populism. Economic fairness, equal opportunity, to break down polarization. And there needs to be negotiation, the skill to negotiate, to restore the essential idea that democracy is about compromise. Without that, there is polarization and gridlock. So that's 3. Fourth, he said, was vote. And the 5th is to recognize that saving democracy is not a liberal cause. It is patriotic duty. Patriotism is about defending democracy, not glorifying the nation. So at this point in the talk, I'm curious about 3 things, and I'd like to hear your thoughts. What do you have to say about not about Professor Shattuck's analysis? If you wish to, you can, but really these are his ideas, that's what he said. Let's say some of them are true, at least at some aspect of it. What would you have to say about the professor's 5 conditions that need to pertain for our democracy to be saved? 3 of them I see as relating to the practice of mutual love. And can you find mutual love as a quality of government in heaven, operating within those conditions? So I have that's a question. I'm curious about that. The second, what comes up for you when you hear this idea posed at the beginning, the most difficult idea? I'll say it again. It is worth noting that what we have in common with angels and what we possess that they lack. We have in common with angels the fact that the deeper levels of our minds are in the image of heaven and can be opened to the degree that we participate in the qualities of mutual love. What we have that angels lack is that our more outward levels of the mind are formed in the image of the world. That is the level at which we've been speaking. That's the world. And that to the extent that we are engaged in that world from a place of mutual love, the world within us is subordinated to heaven within us and serves it. The Lord is then present with us on both levels as he is in heaven. I'm curious about where you are with that. And then third and finally, what about these levels of the human mind? What's with that? Is that right? Are they there? Can they be opened to mirror the levels of heaven? If so, how? And what difference would that make anyway in the world? Okay, so there's 3 sets of questions. I'd like to start with the first one, which is, I'm just going to read the 3 that I think are related to a condition that would be required to address the risk of losing democracy. There would have to be an effort to, 1, understand he's calling it a populist rebellion. Perhaps you know what he's talking about. We're not analyzing that particular view or language, but to understand the populist rebellion as an authentic, real response to perceived inequality and the excesses of globalism. We need to listen to their demands seriously to be included in the benefits of economic prosperity for all. to build coalitions across political divides, put aside differences in order to connect for an inclusive populism, equal opportunity, the breakdown of polarization, and third, negotiate to restore the essential idea that democracy is about compromise. Without that, there is polarization and gridlock. With that, I wish to hear your thoughts. Thank you. I see 2 hands. I see 3. I see 4. Whoa. Okay, so that's Kenneth, Randall, Susanna, and Ivan. Okay, Kenneth?
Well, first I have a question for you, and then I can think what I'm going to say is going to touch on everything you talked about. Remember last year I gave you a book?
I do.
Did you ever read it?
I did.
This is a book called...
This is going to be a tough question.
That was the question. It's called The Better Angels of Our Nature by
Right.
Steven Pinker.
That's right.
And he sort of goes back as far as we can in history and just documents how people have treated people over the years, and essentially proves that all these things that Gard's talking about are in fact happening, and that it is getting better, and that we now live in the best time that people have ever treated each other. But I think what happens is we get bogged down with this disinformation,
Yeah.
and it's hard to focus on what's really happening. We don't have a clear picture of it.
Okay.
And I think that he basically boils it down to the golden rule.
Yeah.
If we could simply follow that everything would get better.
Yeah.
And so it sort of goes to
I love it.
personal enlightenment that you can then share with your family and your friends, and that's if people keep doing that, then it's going to keep getting better and better. It's just a kind of a slow process, but I do believe that that's true.
Everybody, we're going to take just a moment to listen to what Kenneth just said. I honor it. It's wonderful. And actually, I'm going to offer a little support for that view. What I didn't say is Professor Shattuck happens to be an optimist. And he says something very much like what we just heard from Kenneth. From a big picture, he believes in that fundamental goodness. I'll come back to that, but thank you very much, Kevin. Kenneth, boy, I tell you, the mouth, the brain, it's not quite connecting today. But I didn't sleep last night. Okay, Kenneth, thank you. I think Randall, Susanna, and Ivan.
I'll pass, I wasn't really.
Are you passing why?
Because I was just pointing to Kevin, not really volunteering.
Oh, you were?
Where's Kevin?
Kenneth. Okay, we'll come back to you. Susanna.
Well, I just wanted to comment on that you came back to this mutual love as
Yes.
the goal. And I had the experience at convention of sitting down and talking to someone who had a totally different perspective on life than I did. And I listened. And in the listening, we didn't have an argument, we didn't talk about the things that we disagreed about, but after we were sitting there together, we both felt closer and then went our separate ways. And I like that it's the mutual love that's important. We still don't have to understand each other. We don't have to get on the same page about issues to still have the unity of love, that the charity between us united where the doctrine would have divided. So if that's the goal, then we can still be in difference even though we are.
See a hand? Okay, a hand. We'll come back to that. Now I might need a little help, Susanna, if I say a name. I don't want to miss anybody. We're going to come back to what Susanna just said. Just to note that there was freedom. You don't have to agree with the other person. But nonetheless, there was a shift of consciousness in your interaction, which you reported. Just wanted to note it. I have Ivan. I think I'll then go to Ken.
Kevin.
Wait a minute. Kent, and I did see a hand over here. Were you pointing again, Randall?
I wanted to comment on Susanna.
Please do, and then I'm going to go to Ivan.
Okay, just a personal example. I have really my best friend down in North Carolina, and she is really hardline, right, conservative, Republican, everything, and I'm in the middle of the road. But anyway, we have these really heated discussions, but at the same time, know that we both are for the greater good, and we still love each other, even though we totally disagree in our conversations. But it's just like what you said, and I always feel good about it. Thank you.
Awesome. Ivan,
I have a few thoughts. One is that I think that it's not like I don't want to discount the importance of spiritual and changes in the ways that people think. But I think that it's important to acknowledge that as much as the material conditions that we live in follow our spiritual beliefs, our spiritual beliefs also follow the material conditions that we live in. And I think that it is missing a big part of the picture to say that what we need in order to transform the world is a change in spiritual thought, because a change in spiritual thought also requires a change in how the world is materially. It won't just happen magically. It has to be done in the physical world.
beautiful, beautiful. Do you have that's wonderful. Was there anything else you want to add to that?
My other
Yeah.
feeling sort of related to that, I think I would disagree with the assertion that we live in a time of people treating each other well in an unprecedented way. I think that if we go back to looking at pre-agricultural societies, a lot of them, although there is a lot of war, which is something that, bad. There's also, I think, as far as we can tell, people treated each other with far more social equality than we do today, because they knew how to maintain social equality and aggressively defend social equality. When people would try to seize power, it would be actively stifled. And I think that that's something that we're missing in today's society.
Ivan, thank you so much. That's wonderful to hear. So, let those thoughts sort of sink in, and I'm going to call on Kent.
Somewhere in the Third Testament, it talks about how unless evils are brought out into the open, they cannot be healed. So when I see things going on in the world and our country that are disheartening, I do take comfort in knowing that it's most likely that at the end of whatever will happen, and it may get bad and worse, good will prevail. And especially when I think about my children in relation to the environment, eventually people are going to have to wake up and start working with nature instead of against her. And the same thing politically. So throughout the whole universe, from the beginning till now, you see evolution, things going from lesser to greater organization. So I feel like spiritually and socially, that same force is at work, and that's providence.
a deep optimism. It's grounded in our theology, in the writings.
Yeah.
And I might just ask you, as I do you see evidence, as I do and perhaps many do, of exactly that beginning to happen? Of positive response, perhaps from the ground up, small scale, of responses to the environmental crisis, which is recognized now as perhaps occurring faster than we dreamed. Do you or anyone else see evidence of some kind of groundswell, quiet as it may be, probably from the bottom up, in response to these issues? Okay, so I'm gonna call on, I'll tell you,
Kevin.
it's gonna be Kevin. So, the Reverend Ross Taylor, Trevor, and then Ivan. Please,
Oh, I'm just responding to your question
please
about
do.
seeing evidence of what Kent is referring to,
Right.
which I was very heartened by the rise of the Me Too movement.
Uh-huh.
And I just like read recently, and I can't remember whether they were talking about Clarence Thomas or somebody who had been accused of some kind of sexual or inappropriate relationships with women, and was able to sort of brush it aside and go ahead with their career. If that would happen now, that would, you know, the Me Too, the awareness that it's not okay to treat women or other people in the way people have in the past. It's a non-starter now. And that's just happened within a few years. To me, it's amazing.
Thank you. Trevor?
I'd like to underscore what Kent said. We can't solve any social problems until they come to the surface. And we often think of the most emotionally charged issues first, but there's really simple ones that we do too, and it works across the board. You know, we discovered, 15 years ago that we shouldn't sneeze into our hand anymore, so we sneeze into our elbow now. And it's just a simple thing, but it spread germs. So it's that kind of easiness that we can do the same thing with the larger social issues. It has to come into the conscious first, it works it through the system, and then we come up with a way that works better.
Ta-da! Is that a hand? Okay, Ivan, and then Aaliyah.
I agree that I think there is sort of an increasing consciousness of the general problems that we're facing. But I think the problem is that some people who hold power, most people who hold power, I would say, or almost all of them, have a vested interest which is different from the interests of the vast majority of people. And so I think that in addition to acting individually, knowing that when you act, you're acting along with the vast majority of people is really important.
Thank you. Aaliyah.
So from the perspective of an educator, so I've been working in and out of schools for 15 years, and
Can
then
everybody hear?
and then offer my perspective as being a student in the same area. I work now currently in middle school, high school, and the first couple of months I got nervous. I've always been in elementary schools that I would be around violence and anger and aggression, and I have not seen any. And in fact, there's no more detention room. That the progression of education to be more representative of a democratic society is very evident to me when I reflect on my experience in that same area. And it was very authoritarian and you stand there, of course, the teacher stands there and you listen and you take notes and you get in trouble and you go in the corner, and those days are gone. And when I see the middle schoolers, which is a very, I think, kind of naturally frustrated, aggressive age, I have not seen any violence. And in fact, there's a lot of young boys sitting next to each other, putting their arms around each other and rubbing their backs and asking how their day goes, opening the door for me when they see me carrying things and asking me how my day is. And I reflect on my experience as a middle schooler, and it didn't look that way. And so education has been, in some respects, slowly getting to that point. But to me, it's made a huge difference in the generation coming up, how caring and compassionate they are. And so that gives me hope.
And that is an evidence-based comment from an educator in the field, and I've seen the same thing. Okay, other hands? So, Martha.
Yes, I'll follow up with Leah. I think also that there's probably less violence and more respect now between young people. And I think the reason that we don't all agree or see it is because of media. I mean, I remember when my children were really young, a schoolhouse shooting that didn't get any attention. It was there, and you heard it maybe a month after it happened, or 2 months after it happened, or something. But now, if there's a shooting somewhere, it's on the news 24/7. I mean, they don't drop it, and that makes it look like the whole world is out shooting people.
Whereas we're the most peaceful we've ever been in history.
What?
Whereas we're the most peaceful we've ever been in history.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, so that speaks to Kenneth's point, and there is a lot of evidence of a lot of goodness, and we have a doctrinal basis for it. So as we conclude, there's this lingering question. There's a question about this notion of transformation of consciousness. We won't get to that now, but I'd like to pose it. It's implied as necessary, explicated as necessary. And what is it, and what is the relation of the transformation of consciousness, which presumably happens within individuals, perhaps and likely within the context of community? What is it, and what is the relation between a transformation of consciousness and the goodness that we begin to see from the ground up? And I asked, what difference does that make anyway? Can that difference be made explicit? And at what scale? And with that, we'll take one more comment because we're up to time. And
Well, I just want to reflect back on that experience of sitting with someone. I had to want to care about that person, even to sit down and listen. And I think that's part of the transformation. It's not going to just happening randomly that we're going to start loving each other more. We have to want that.
on that note, I will observe that after the second lecture, there will be a discussion group in this room at 11 o'clock. And for those of you who can come, you're certainly invited to continue this aspect of the conversation. And we'll have a second lecture with Kent Rogers at 10 o'clock. Thank you very much.